At 2:27 a.m., she sipped wine alone, unaware the Duke had his eyes on her. The heavy velvet drapes of the library at Ravenhurst Manor swept down toward polished mahogany floors, muffling the rhythmic pattern of autumn rain beating against the leaded glass windows. Outside, the vast estate nestled in the dark, rolling hills of Sussex lay shrouded in mist. Inside, the quiet was thick enough to feel. Lady Clara Montgomery lifted her crystal glass to her lips, allowing the rich garnet liquid to warm her tongue, while her eyes traced the flickering shadows cast by the grand stone fireplace. At 24, she was a widow of independent mind, though in the rigid confines of Victorian high society, independence was merely a polite term for precarious isolation. She believed herself entirely unobserved in the dead of night, seeking refuge from the suffocating grandeur of the Duke's seasonal autumn ball. She did not hear the faint rustle of tailor-made wool against the carpet, nor did she notice the tall figure standing in the darkened recess between two carved oak bookcases, the master of the estate, Sebastian Vance, the 7th Duke of Avon, watching her with a silent, intense vigilance that pierced through the gloomy quiet. Clara adjusted the high lace collar of her dark emerald silk gown, a modest yet exquisite garment that marked her as a woman still respecting the extended boundaries of half-mourning. 2 years had passed since the tragic and sudden death of her husband, Lord Thomas Montgomery, a charming young aristocrat whose grand promises had crumbled into mountains of hidden debt. His demise had left Clara with a respectable title, an empty bank account, and a cloud of quiet suspicion woven by a vengeful mother-in-law, the Dowager Countess of Stirling. To preserve what little dignity she retained, Clara had accepted an invitation to Ravenhurst Manor under the guise of an honored guest. In reality, she was searching for something far more urgent, a lost codicil to her late husband's estate papers, rumored to be hidden among the personal correspondence of the late Duke of Avon, Thomas's closest confidant. Without that document, the remaining ancestral home of her own family in Kent would be auctioned off by the turn of the year to satisfy creditors who pounded relentless demands upon her door. Sebastian stepped forward from the shadow, his boots making no sound upon the oriental rug, until he deliberately allowed the subtle clink of his pocket watch chain to break the silence. The firelight caught the sharp contour of his jawline, the subtle streaks of silver at his temples, and the penetrating gray of his eyes that held the weight of a man carrying the immense, crushing duties of one of the wealthiest peerages in the British Empire. At 32, the Duke of Avon was renowned throughout Mayfair and the House of Lords as a stern, unyielding strategist, entirely unbothered by the relentless courtship of ambitious debutantes and their scheming mothers. Yet as he gazed at Clara standing beside his desk, holding a glass of his private cellar's finest vintage port, a rare, flickering warmth replaced his usual icy composure. A solitary midnight libation is traditionally reserved for those with either a guilty conscience or an unbearable secret, Lady Clara, Sebastian said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated softly against the cavernous room. Clara gasped softly, her hand trembling just enough to cause the wine to swirl against the rim of her glass, though she caught her composure before a single drop spilled. She straightened her posture, turning to face him with the poised elegance expected of a lady of her standing, though her pulse hammered wildly against her ribs. "Your Grace," she murmured, lowering her head in a swift, practiced inclination. "I must apologize for trespassing upon your private sanctuary. The noise and heat of the ballroom had grown quite overwhelming, and I was merely seeking a moment of fresh air and perhaps a briefly borrowed comfort." "You did not choose the conservatory nor the drawing room," Sebastian noted, taking measured steps toward her until he stood just a few feet away. The faint scents of cedarwood, expensive pipe tobacco, and damp autumn rainwater drifted from him, wrapping around her senses. He reached out, his long fingers gently brushing against the edge of an open leather-bound ledger resting on the desk, a ledger she had been subtly leafing through only moments before he made his presence known. "You chose my personal study, a room where few guests dare to wander without an express summons. I have always found books far more accommodating hosts than the London elite, Your Grace," Clara replied, her brown eyes meeting his with a defiance that was as refreshing as it was dangerous. And as for your port, it possesses a remarkable ability to settle one's nerves. A faint, shadowy smile touched the corner of Sebastian's lips, a sight so exceedingly rare that had it occurred in the ballroom 3 floors below, it would have set the tongues of half the peerage wagging for a fortnight. Nerves, Lady Clara? I was unaware that a woman of your formidable composure possessed such frailties. If I recall correctly, you stood before the entire ballroom tonight while the Dowager Countess practically accused you of squandering the Montgomery line into financial ruin, and you did not flinch once. Clara's gaze hardened slightly, a fleeting spark of pain masking itself behind quiet pride. Pride is a coat of armor we widows learn to wear early, Lord Avon. To flinch in front of Lady Sterling is to invite the wolves to feast. Indeed, Sebastian agreed, his voice softening into something surprisingly gentle. He stepped closer, taking the crystal glass from her fingers. His warm skin brushed against hers for a fleeting second, sending an unexpected spark of heat rushing down her spine that caught her entirely off guard. He set the glass onto the mahogany desk next to an unopened letter bearing a dark red wax seal, a seal Clara recognized instantly as belonging to the High Court Solicitors of London. Yet armor can become terribly heavy when worn night and day without relief. "And what of your armor, Your Grace?" Clara countered, stepping back slightly to maintain a respectable distance, though her gaze remained locked onto his. "They say the Duke of Avon carries the weight of half of Sussex upon his shoulders, yet he never permits anyone to see him bend. Perhaps because I have not yet met anyone capable of sharing the weight," he answered softly, his gray eyes piercing hers with an intensity that made the surrounding room seem to shrink into nothingness. For a long, breathless moment, the atmosphere in the library thickened with a dangerous magnetic tension. The storm outside lashed against the panes, casting streaks of rain down the glass like tears. Clara felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to confess the truth of why she was truly there. That she was desperate, that she was terrified of losing the only home her young sister had ever known, and that she felt utterly alone in a world governed by cruel men and calculating women. But the rigid rules of Victorian decorum and the terrifying reality of her ruined reputation held her tongue hostage. Sebastian turned away slowly, walking toward the grand desk. He picked up the sealed letter from London, his expression darkening as he stared down at the red wax. "Society believes that power and title shield a man from ruin, Clara. They do not realize that the higher one sits, the further one has to fall." He hesitated, holding the paper tightly between his fingers before turning his back to her to place it inside a heavy brass lockbox on the wall behind his chair. As he turned his posture, the firelight illuminated a small, half-drawn drawer at the base of his desk, a secret compartment that had popped open when Sebastian's sleeve accidentally brushed a concealed brass latch. Sitting inside, plainly visible beneath a scatter of legal papers, lay a worn silk pocketbook bearing the embroidered initials T.M. The very pocketbook her late husband had carried on the night of his suspicious fatal horse accident 2 years ago. Clara's breath hitched in her throat, her heart slamming violently against her ribs as the cold reality swept over her. The Duke had not merely been acting as an indifferent host. He was in possession of her dead husband's private belongings, items that had mysteriously vanished from the scene of the accident and were rumored to contain the full record of Thomas's hidden debts, along with the names of those he had betrayed. Before she could process the shocking discovery, the quiet click of the study door latch echoed through the room. The door swung open, and standing on the threshold held beneath the dim light of the corridor candle, stood the cold, imposing figure of the Dowager Countess of Sterling, her withered face twisted into an expression of triumphant malice as her eyes darted between Clara and the Duke, standing alone together in the dark at nearly 3 a.m. "How utterly picturesque," the Dowager Countess of Sterling declared, her voice dripping with venomous pleasure as she stepped into the library, the stiff silk of her black taffeta gown rustling loudly against the quiet night. Behind her, a nervous young footman hovered with a silver candelabra, casting long, dramatic shadows across the carved mahogany panels. The grieving widow and the uncompromising Duke, sequestered together at nearly 3 a.m. over a bottle of spirits. I knew your morals were fragile, Clara, but I hardly expected you to compromise yourself so blatantly beneath the roof of your own host. Clara stood her ground, though her blood ran ice cold in her veins. If Lady Sterling broadcasted this scene to the guests staying at Ravenhurst Manor, Clara's reputation, already hanging by a thread, would be utterly destroyed by dawn. She would be cast out of polite society, making any attempt to clear her family's financial honor impossible. Before Clara could speak, Sebastian stepped forward, his towering frame instantly interposing itself between the Countess and Clara. His aura transformed in a fraction of a second. The quiet warmth he had shown moments ago vanished, replaced by an icy, formidable arrogance that had humbled statesmen in Parliament. "You forget yourself, Lady Sterling," Sebastian said, his baritone voice dropping into a register of terrifying calm. "You are a guest in my home, not a magistrate presiding over a court." Lady Clara was distressed by the heat of the ballroom and sought my assistance regarding the management of her late husband's trust, a matter over which I hold sole executorship. Lady Sterling's sneer faltered slightly at the mention of the executorship, but her pale eyes glinted with deep suspicion. "At 3 in the morning, Your Grace?" "The duties of my title do not keep business hours, madam," Sebastian replied coldly, resting his hand casually near the open desk drawer, subtly shifting his position to block the dowager's line of sight to the secret compartment containing Thomas's silk pocketbook. "Furthermore, if you speak another word that impeaches the honor of any guest under the roof of Ravenhurst, I shall ensure your son's remaining debts in London are called in by the Bank of England before the weekend concludes. I believe your family holds quite a large mortgage with them, do they not?" The Countess turned deathly pale. She clutched her pearl necklace, glared at Clara with pure hatred, and gave a stiff, furious nod. "Good night, Your Grace," she hissed, turning on her heel and sweeping out into the corridor, her footman scurrying behind her to close the heavy oak doors. The silence that reclaimed the library was suffocating. Clara stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind spinning with a tempest of conflicting emotions. Gratitude for his swift protection, terror at the scandal she had barely escaped, and a burning, desperate curiosity about the pocketbook hidden only inches from his hand. Sebastian let out a quiet, slow exhale and turned back to her. The razor-sharp edge in his eyes softened as he looked down at her pale face. "She will not speak of this," he murmured softly. "Lady Sterling values her family fortune far more than she values gossip." "Why did you protect me?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. She took a step toward him, her gaze dropping pointedly toward the open drawer. "And why lied for me? You are not the executor of Thomas's trust, Lord Avon. My late husband made sure no one had control over his estate, except his creditors." Sebastian did not flinch, though his jaw tightened. He followed her gaze down to the secret compartment, realizing she had seen it. He reached down with agonizing slowness, pulled the worn silk pocketbook from the drawer, and laid it gently upon the open pages of his ledger. "Because I owed your husband a debt," Sebastian said quietly, his gray eyes searching her face. "And because I know the truth about how he died." Clara felt the room spin. What truth? It was a riding accident in Kent. His horse threw him near the old quarry. "Thomas was one of the finest horsemen in England," Sebastian interrupted gently, taking a step closer. "He did not fall from his mount, Clara. He was murdered." The word hung in the cold night air like a heavy weight. Clara caught her breath, leaning against the edge of the desk for support. "Murdered? That is impossible. The magistrate ruled it in misadventure. The magistrate in Kent was paid £500 to close the inquiry within 24 hours, Sebastian revealed, his voice filled with a quiet, dangerous intensity. He picked up the pocketbook and opened it, revealing pages covered in Thomas's neat, recognizable handwriting, intermingled with lists of dates, numbers, and high society names. "Your husband discovered a massive syndicate of blackmail operating within the highest ranks of the peerage, a network that was siphoning fortunes from vulnerable families and forcing peers to vote on specific legislation in the House of Lords. Thomas came to me 3 days before he died, terrified. He gave me this book for safekeeping. Clara stared at the pocketbook, her mind racing. If he gave it to you, why did you never bring it to the authorities? Why did you let his family believe he died in disgrace, leaving me to face his debts alone? Because the man leading that syndicate sits in the cabinet, Sebastian replied, his tone laced with deep bitterness. And until tonight, I lacked the final piece of evidence to bring him down without destroying innocent people in the process. I kept you at a distance, Clara, to protect you. If those men knew you had any knowledge of what Thomas possessed, your life would not have been worth a single copper. He stepped closer still, so near she could feel the radiating heat of his body and smell the crisp autumn night air lingering on his linen shirt. The proximity was scandalously close, yet neither of me moved away. In the dim firelight, the fierce, protective warmth in his gaze was unmistakable, melting away the icy reputation of the stern Duke. I have spent 2 years searching for the truth, Sebastian murmured, his voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper that brushed against her skin. Not just to clear Thomas's name, but because every time I looked at you across a crowded ballroom, forced to watch you suffer the cruel judgment of society, it tore at my soul. Clara looked up into his intense gray eyes, feeling a breath-stealing wave of emotion wash over her. The stern, distant nobleman she had feared and suspected was revealed to be her secret guardian, carrying a burden far heavier than she had ever imagined. The romantic tension between them, long suppressed beneath layers of widow's mourning and aristocrat pride, ignited into something fierce and undeniable. "Show me," Clara whispered, her fingers reaching out to touch the worn fabric of the pocketbook resting near his hand. "If my husband died for this, I have a right to know who destroyed our lives." Sebastian hesitated, his hand hovering over hers, his thumb gently brushing the back of her knuckles in a tender gesture that made her pulse leap. "It is dangerous, Clara. Once you see the names, there is no turning back. My life was already ruined the moment Thomas died," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. "I will not live in the shadows any longer." Relenting, Sebastian nodded slowly. He unfolded a yellowed piece of paper tucked deep inside the pocketbook's hidden lining, a letter written in an elegant, flowing script bearing a distinctive wax seal depicting a coiled viper above a lion's crest. Clara gasped as her eyes scanned the lines. It was a formal agreement demanding the transfer of her family's ancestral estate in Kent to satisfy a fraudulent debt. But it was the signature at the bottom that made the blood run cold in her veins. The letter was signed not by an unknown moneylender, but by Sir Arthur Montgomery, her late husband's elder brother, the respected diplomatic envoy to France and the current heir presumptive to the Earl of Stirling. Before Clara could process the horrifying betrayal by her own brother-in-law, a loud, sharp crash echoed from the hallway outside, followed immediately by the desperate shout of a footman and the heavy, metallic thump of the library door being violently thrown open. The heavy doors slammed back against the dark oak paneling with a crack like thunder. Clara jerked around, her hand instinctively catching Sebastian's forearm as 3 men in soot-stained wool coats and low-slung caps strode into the library. The leader, a broad-shouldered brute with a jagged scar running from ear to jaw, held an iron crowbar, while his 2 companions carried heavy ashwood clubs. Behind them in the shadowy corridor lay the unconscious body of the young footman, his silver candelabra clattering across the marble floor. "Out of the way, Your Grace," the scarred man growled, his thick London accent piercing the quiet elegance of the room. "We came for the dead lord's book, and we aren't leaving without it." Sebastian didn't flinch. With smooth, practiced grace, he stepped in front of Clara, shielding her completely behind his broad back. "You have trespassed upon the estate of Avon," Sebastian said, his tone chillingly soft, carrying an absolute authority that made the lead intruder hesitate for a fraction of a second. "You will drop your weapons and surrender to my gamekeepers, or you will not leave Sussex alive." "We take our orders from higher men than you, Governor," the man sneered, lunging forward with his crowbar raised. What followed was a swift, chaotic blur of violence. Sebastian moved with lethal precision, a testament to his years as a cavalry officer in his youth. He dodged the brute's wild swing, caught the man's wrist, and drove a crushing elbow into his ribs. The second intruder charged with a club, but Sebastian pivoted, sweeping the man's legs out from under him and driving him forcefully into the side of the mahogany desk. "Clara, behind the desk!" Sebastian commanded, his voice raw with exertion as he struggled against the third assailant who had tackled him toward the blazing hearth. Clara's heart hammered furiously against her ribs. She didn't flee. Looking frantically around the hearth, her eyes caught the heavy brass poker leaning against the stone mantel. Raising the solid iron rod with both hands, she rushed forward as the lead intruder pinned Sebastian against the edge of the fireplace, raising his knife to strike. With all the strength born of sheer desperation, Clara swung the brass poker into the attacker's shoulder. The brute screamed in pain, dropping his blade as he stumbled back. Sebastian immediately seized the opening, delivering a devastating right hook to the man's jaw that sent him crashing unconscious onto the hearth rug. Breathing heavily, his tie loosened and hair dark with sweat, Sebastian turned to Clara. For a second, his gray eyes burned with an intense, fierce pride. He reached out, grabbing her waist gently to pull her away from the fallen men. "Are you unhurt?" he asked, his hands trembling slightly as they touched her cheeks, searching her face for any sign of injury. "I am unhurt," she whispered, breathless, her fingers clutching his torn velvet lapel. "Sebastian." They knew the book was here. How could they possibly know? Before he could answer, the sharp sound of applause echoed from the open doorway. Clara and Sebastian spun around. Standing on the threshold, flanked by two armed men in dark traveling coats, was Sir Arthur Montgomery himself. He wore a perfectly tailored navy overcoat, his silver-topped cane gleaming beneath the hallway sconces, his expression one of icy amusement. "Bravo, sister-in-law," Arthur drawled, stepping over the threshold with smooth, sinister elegance. "I always knew you possessed spirit, though I hardly expected you to play the tavern brawler for my brother's memory." "Arthur," Clara gasped, her stomach twisting into a sickening knot. "You sent these cutthroats?" "I needed what belonged to Thomas," Arthur said calmly, taking off his leather gloves finger by finger. "My late brother was a fool. He stumbled upon my network, thought he could play the moral savior, and tried to expose me to the Prime Minister. I had to ensure he met with a unfortunate riding accident in Kent. And now, my dear Clara, you have made my task remarkably simple by gathering both the pocketbook and the Duke in one convenient location." Sebastian's arm tightened around Clara, his body rigid with fury. "You will never leave Ravenhurst with those papers, Montgomery. The house is surrounded by 50 groundskeepers and grooms. A single shout will bring them here." "A shout you will not have the breath to make, Your Grace," Arthur replied, pulling a small nickel-plated pocket pistol from his coat pocket and pointing it directly at Sebastian's chest. "You see, society is so terribly predictable. By morning the story will be quite clear. The grieving Lady Clara came to Ravenhurst to bargain for her family's debts. A bitter argument ensued with her generous host, and tragic shots were fired in the dark. A double tragedy. And as the sole surviving guardian of the Montgomery estate, I shall inherit everything." Clara felt cold terror grip her soul, but as her eyes darted across the desk, she noticed something Arthur could not see from the doorway. The London solicitor's letter that Sebastian had set down earlier, the one bearing the red wax seal, was lying face down, its secondary parchment exposed. On the back was a wax imprint she had failed to notice before, the seal of the Royal Courts of Justice, alongside a freshly stamped royal warrant for the arrest of Sir Arthur Montgomery for high treason and extortion. Sebastian had not been keeping the pocketbook to hide it. He had already submitted the evidence to the Crown days ago. This letter was the official execution of the arrest order, awaiting the arrival of the High Sheriff of Sussex at dawn. Sebastian's gaze flicked down to the letter, then met Clara's. In that unspoken glance, a silent communication passed between them. He was waiting for her signal, playing for time until the dawn patrol arrived. "You think you have won, Arthur?" Clara said, stepping slightly sideways, drawing Arthur's gun sights toward her and away from Sebastian. Her voice was steady, filled with a cold, deceptive calm. "You killed your own brother for money and power, but Thomas was smarter than you ever were. He knew you were weak." Arthur's jaw tightened, his aristocratic composure cracking with sudden rage. "Keep your tongue, girl. Thomas was a pathetic dreamer who—" "Thomas knew you were a coward," Clara interrupted, taking a deliberate step forward, forcing Arthur to shift his stance. "And he left a second record, one that isn't in this room." Arthur's eyes narrowed in momentary panic, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Where?" he demanded, his focus entirely consumed by her bluff. At that exact split second of distraction, Sebastian lunged forward. He slammed his weight into Arthur's arm just as the pistol discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet shattering a glass cabinet behind them. The weapon clattered to the floor, and Sebastian pinned Arthur against the heavy oak bookcase, his hands locked around her brother-in-law's collar. "It is over, Montgomery," Sebastian growled into his ear. "The High Sheriff is already at the gates." Outside, the distant, frantic barking of hounds and the heavy thunder of horses galloping up the gravel drive shattered the night, signaling the arrival of the authorities. Arthur sneered, a desperate mad glint in his eye. With a sudden, violent twist, he reached into his inner waistcoat, pulled a tiny concealed boot dagger, and struck wildly at Sebastian's chest. Sebastian gasped, staggering back as blood instantly bloomed across the crisp white linen of his shirt. "Sebastian!" Clara screamed, her world collapsing as the Duke collapsed onto one knee, his blood staining the velvet carpet, while Arthur broke free and fled toward the side terrace doors, leading out into the pitch-black rain. Clara did not hesitate. Ignoring the frantic shouts echoing down the corridor and the thunder of approaching horses outside, she dropped to her knees beside Sebastian. Her hands pressed hard against the wound on his chest, her fingers immediately staining crimson with his blood. "Stay with me, Sebastian. Please, look at me," she cried, her voice cracking with an agonizing mixture of terror and fierce devotion. Sebastian gasped, his face pale as marble in the firelight, but his hand reached up, his weak fingers wrapping tightly around hers. The papers, Clara," he rasped, his gray eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "Do not let him. Take them." "Forget the papers," she sobbed, tears finally breaking past her long-held defenses and streaming down her face. "I care nothing for estates or debts if I lose you. Do you hear me? You cannot leave me alone in this dark world." A faint, breathless smile touched his lips, despite the agony searing through his chest. "I have no intention of leaving you, my sweet Clara," he whispered. The library doors burst open once more, but this time it was not cutthroats who entered. The High Sheriff of Sussex, accompanied by 4 armed constables and a doctor, surged into the room. Behind them, servants carrying lanterns gaped in horror at the bloody scene. "Apprehend Arthur Montgomery!" the sheriff barked, pointing toward the open terrace doors where the rain poured into the room. "He is armed and dangerous. Secure the perimeter." While 2 constables gave chase into the stormy night, the doctor rushed to Sebastian's side, unrolling a leather satchel of instruments. "Stand back, Lady Clara. Let me tend to his grace." Clara refused to let go of Sebastian's hand until the doctor gently pried her fingers loose to apply pressure and bandages to the blade wound. She sat on the carpet beside him, her gown stained with his blood, holding his face in her hands and whispering words of love and encouragement, until the physician confirmed the dagger had missed his heart by half an inch. The Duke would live. 3 weeks later, the late autumn rain had cleared, leaving behind a crisp golden morning over the rolling hills of Sussex. The scandal that had rocked the British Empire had finally begun to settle. Sir Arthur Montgomery had been captured near the docks of Liverpool, attempting to flee to America. His network of blackmail was completely dismantled, his co-conspirators in Parliament arrested, and the fraudulent debts levied against Clara's family were declared null and void by the Crown. Clara's ancestral home in Kent was saved. Her late husband's name was fully exonerated, and the Dowager Countess had fled to an obscure village in Wales to escape the crushing humiliation. Inside the quiet elegance of Ravenhurst Manor, the afternoon sun spilled through the high stained glass windows of the drawing room, illuminating vibrant arrangements of fresh white roses. Sebastian sat in a plush armchair beside the hearth, dressed in a comfortable dark velvet jacket, his color returned, and his strength steadily recovering. Across from him sat Clara, looking radiant in a soft lavender silk gown, having finally discarded the gloomy black garments of mourning forever. "The London newspapers are calling you the heroine of the decade, you know," Sebastian said softly, his baritone voice warm as he looked at her over the rim of his teacup. "The Times wrote a whole column praising the courage of Lady Clara Montgomery." Clara laughed softly, a bright, melodic sound that filled the room. "The Times exaggerates, Your Grace. I merely held a brass poker and refused to run away." "You saved my life, Clara," Sebastian said, his expression turning deeply serious. He set his teacup down upon the silver tray and leaned forward, his gray eyes locked onto hers with an intense, unwavering devotion. "And you saved me from a life spent in cold, isolated duty." Clara felt her heart swell, her pulse accelerating as she met his gaze. "You saved me first, Sebastian. You bore a terrible burden in silence for 2 years, just to protect my honor and my life." Sebastian stood up slowly, carefully favoring his bandaged side, and walked across the Persian rug until he stood directly before her. He reached down, taking both of her hands in his, bringing them to his lips to press a tender kiss against her knuckles. "When I watched you sip wine alone in my library at 2 a.m, I thought you were the most intriguing mystery I had ever encountered," he whispered, his voice trembling with quiet emotion. "Now I know that you are the only woman I could ever love. The title of Duke means nothing to me without you by my side to share it." Tears of joy brimmed in Clara's eyes. She stood up, stepping close into his embrace, careful not to press against his injury, and looked up into the face of the man who had become her protector, her confidant, and her true love. "I spent so long believing my heart was buried in the past," Clara murmured, placing her hand gently against his cheek. "But you showed me that second chances are worth fighting for. My heart is yours, Sebastian, today and always." Sebastian leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a deep, passionate kiss that sealed their unspoken promise, a kiss that tasted of sweet victory, profound healing, and a glorious, unwritten future together. In the grand halls of Victorian society, where honor was often traded for ambition and truth was hidden behind velvet curtains, love proved to be the only legacy that could never be stolen. For Clara and Sebastian, the dark shadows of the past had finally burned away, leaving behind a light bright enough to guide them through a lifetime together.